The massive doors of the Galactic Council chambers slid shut with a heavy thud that seemed to echo forever. Ambassador Kelrath pressed his six-fingered hands against the cool metal railing and stared at the holographic display floating in the center of the room. Another red dot had just disappeared. Another star system was gone. Billions of lives, entire civilizations, reduced to empty space in mere hours. The void swarm was unstoppable. These mechanical creatures had appeared from the dark spaces between galaxies 3 months ago, and since then they had been eating everything in their path. They consumed planets, stripped stars of their energy, and turned entire solar systems into lifeless husks. The greatest military minds in the galaxy had tried everything. Energy weapons barely scratched their hulls. Nuclear missiles were absorbed and converted into more swarm units. Even the legendary crystal warriors of Thane's people had been swept aside like dust. Kelrath watched the tactical display update again. 17 civilizations had already fallen completely. The Mechari Trade Federation, the spiritual collective of Voss, the artistic Lumiron Empire, all gone. Their beautiful cities, their ancient cultures, their billions of citizens, all converted into raw materials for the swarm's endless hunger. High Commander Thane stood at the center of the chamber, his tall crystalline body catching the light from the holographic display. His species had evolved from living crystals, and when they were stressed or afraid, patterns of light would flicker beneath their transparent skin. Right now, Thane looked like a lightning storm trapped in glass. The hegemony fleet is gone, Thane announced to the gathered representatives. His voice carried the weight of absolute defeat. Admiral Vextar's entire armada was destroyed in the Kepler sector. They managed to take down maybe 50 swarm units. 50. Out of millions. A murmur of despair rippled through the chamber. The hegemony had possessed the most powerful military in the galaxy. If their fleet couldn't even slow down the void swarm, what hope did anyone else have? The Arthurian defense grid fell this morning, continued another representative. The void swarm broke through their planetary shields in less than 6 hours. We're receiving emergency broadcasts from the outer colonies, but communications are going dark one by one. Kelrath felt his stomach twist into knots. He had friends on those colonies. Good people who had spent their lives building homes, raising families, creating art and music and literature. Now they were all gone, consumed by machines that didn't even understand what they had destroyed. There is one option left, Thane said quietly. The chamber fell completely silent. One species we haven't contacted. You can't be serious, whispered Ambassador Yara from the Peaceful Coalition. Her blue skin had turned pale gray with fear. The quarantine exists for good reasons. The humans, Kelrath breathed, hardly believing the words as they left his mouth. You're talking about the Deathworlders. Every being in the chamber knew the stories. Sol 3, the third planet in a remote yellow star system, housed a species so violent and unpredictable that the Galactic Council had voted to quarantine them 50 years ago. The reports from the first contact team had been horrifying. These creatures had evolved on a world of such brutal conditions that they considered war to be entertainment. They fought each other constantly, sometimes over resources, sometimes over ideas, sometimes just for sport. Their planet was a nightmare of natural disasters, predatory animals, and environmental extremes that would kill most galactic species in minutes. And somehow, these humans had not only survived but thrived. They had built cities in deserts that could melt metal. They lived on frozen mountaintops where the air was too thin to breathe. They sailed across oceans during storms that could tear apart starships. The first contact team had recommended immediate military intervention to contain the threat. But when the Council sent scouts to observe human military capabilities, what they found was even more terrifying. These creatures had developed weapons capable of destroying their own planet multiple times over. They had fought wars involving hundreds of millions of soldiers. They had survived plagues, asteroid impacts, ice ages, and volcanic eruptions that had wiped out entire ecosystems. They're monsters, someone whispered from the back of the chamber. Maybe, Thane replied, his crystalline form flickering with desperate patterns of light. But there are monsters now. The vote was quick and unanimous. Even the peaceful coalition, who had spent centuries advocating for non-violence, raised their hands in agreement. When faced with extinction, even pacifists could recognize the need for predators. The message was sent using emergency quantum channels that reached across the galaxy in minutes. It was simple and direct: the galaxy is dying. We need your help. Will you fight? The response came back even faster than expected. A single word: coming. Within 6 hours, the early warning sensors around the Council station began screaming alerts. Ships were dropping out of hyperspace at velocities that should have been impossible. The readings made no sense. These vessels were performing jumps that should have liquefied their crews from the gravitational forces alone. But the ships kept coming. Crude, angular vessels that looked like they had been built for war and nothing else. They moved with an efficiency that was almost mechanical, forming perfect attack formations as they emerged from their impossible hyperspace jumps. The lead ship requested permission to dock, and moments later, the airlocks cycled open. Captain Tyler Morrison stepped onto the station, and Kelrath felt his blood run cold. This was not what he had expected. The stories had described savage barbarians, wild creatures driven by bloodlust and violence. But Morrison was calm, professional, almost serene. He moved with the controlled grace of a predator, but his eyes held the steady intelligence of a seasoned military commander. Morrison's gaze swept across the assembled alien diplomats, taking in their fearful expressions and defensive postures. He studied the tactical displays showing the void swarms advance, analyzed the casualty reports with the same detached interest that others might show while reading weather forecasts. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet, conversational, but somehow it carried clearly to every corner of the chamber. "We received your message," Morrison said, his hands clasped behind his back. "We're here to help. Now, what exactly do you need dead?" The battle began at dawn, ship time. Lieutenant Beth Collins gripped the controls of her fighter as she dove straight into what every tactical manual in the galaxy would call certain death. The debris field ahead of her was a graveyard of twisted metal and superheated plasma, the remains of 3 different alien fleets that had tried to stop the void swarm's advance. The chunks of destroyed starships spun through space like deadly confetti, each piece capable of punching through the hull of her small craft. But Beth didn't slow down. She couldn't. Behind her, Sergeant Danny Reeves was manually loading torpedo tubes while their ship leaked atmosphere through 6 different hull breaches. The automated systems had failed 20 minutes ago, along with life support, navigation, and pretty much everything else that kept a spacecraft functional. They were flying on backup power, breathing recycled air, and relying on instruments that sparked every time they hit turbulence. "Torpedo loaded," Danny called out, his voice muffled by the emergency oxygen mask strapped to his face. Blood was trickling from a cut on his forehead where a piece of shrapnel had gotten through his helmet, but his hands remained steady as he worked. "Roger that," Beth replied, spinning her fighter through a gap between 2 massive chunks of hull plating that would have crushed them like a bug. She could see their target ahead, a void swarm destroyer, black as space itself, its surface covered with the writhing mechanical tentacles that the swarm used to tear apart enemy ships. From the observation deck of the Council station, Ambassador Kelrath watched the battle unfold through the massive viewing windows. What he was seeing made no sense according to everything he knew about warfare, tactics, or basic survival instincts. The human fighters were flying through conditions that should have been impossible to navigate. They were taking damage that should have forced them to retreat. They were engaging in maneuvers that violated every principle of self-preservation. A human destroyer, the USC Phoenix, had lost its main weapons array 10 minutes into the fight. Standard military doctrine would have called for immediate withdrawal to repair facilities. Instead, Captain Amy Rodriguez was ordering her crew to ram the enemy flagship at full speed. "All hands, this is the captain," Rodriguez's voice crackled over the communications channel. "We're going to show these machines how humans say goodbye. Engineering, I need everything you've got in the reactor. Navigation, plot a collision course. All crew, it's been an honor serving with you. The response from her crew was not panic or despair, but something that chilled Kelrath to his core. They were singing. The humans were actually singing as they prepared to die. It was an old song from their homeworld, something about going down fighting and never giving up. Their voices joined together in harmony as the Phoenix accelerated toward the massive Void Swarm vessel. "They're insane," whispered Ambassador Yara, her blue skin pale with shock. "They're actually choosing to die." But Kelrath was beginning to understand that this wasn't insanity. This was something far more frightening. The humans weren't throwing their lives away recklessly. They were spending them carefully, like currency, purchasing victories with blood and sacrifice in a way that no other species had ever conceived. Commander Travis Bennett was coordinating the human fleet from the bridge of the flagship Defiant, even though his left arm hung at an unnatural angle from where a console had exploded during the opening moments of the battle. Medical scanners showed that he had 3 broken ribs and internal bleeding, but he refused to leave his post. Every few minutes, he would pause to inject himself with a pain suppressor, then immediately return to directing the complex dance of death that his ships were performing. "Beta Squadron, I need you to draw fire from the eastern flank," Travis called out, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead from pain. "Charlie Squadron, you're going to punch through their defensive line and hit those command nodes. Don't worry about coming back, we'll send Gamma Squadron to finish what you start." The human pilots acknowledged their orders without question, even though everyone understood what "don't worry about coming back" really meant. They were being ordered to die, and they accepted it as naturally as breathing. A Void Swarm cruiser had locked onto Lieutenant Beth Collins' fighter, its energy weapons charging for what should have been a killing blow. Beth's fighter was already running on emergency power, her shields were down, and her engines were damaged. Any rational pilot would have tried to escape. Instead, Beth turned directly toward the enemy ship and pushed her engines to maximum burn. "Danny, you ready back there?" "Born ready," came the reply from the weapons station. "Let's show these tin cans what crazy looks like." The Void Swarm cruiser fired, its plasma beams designed to vaporize small craft instantly. But Beth's fighter wasn't where the targeting computers expected it to be. She had rolled at the last second, using the enemy's own weapon discharge to mask her approach. The torpedo Danny had manually loaded struck the cruiser's reactor core dead center. Both ships disappeared in a flash of white light that lit up the entire battlefield. "They fight like they're already dead," Kelrath whispered to himself, unable to look away from the carnage. Commander Bennett, still directing the battle with his shattered arm, happened to hear the comment. He turned slightly, his eyes never leaving the tactical display that showed human casualties mounting by the minute. "Death's just another mission parameter," Bennett replied matter-of-factly. "We plan for it, we account for it, and we use it when we have to. The difference between us and everyone else is that we figured out how to make dying useful." On the display, another human ship vanished in a ball of fire, taking a Void Swarm destroyer with it. The humans were winning, but the price they were paying made Kelrath's stomach turn. These creatures weren't just willing to die for victory, they had turned self-sacrifice into an art form. The Void Swarm was learning. That was the terrifying reality that hit everyone in the third hour of the battle. These machines weren't just mindless destroyers, they were adaptive, intelligent, and getting better at killing humans with every passing minute. Captain Tyler Morrison had been moved to the medical bay after taking shrapnel to the chest during a surprise attack on the command bridge. The human flagship's medical facility was a scene of controlled chaos, with wounded soldiers laid out on every available surface. The smell of burned flesh and antiseptic filled the air, mixed with the acrid smoke from damaged electrical systems. Morrison's breathing was shallow and labored. The medical scanners showed massive internal damage, his lung had been punctured, and he was bleeding internally. Any other species would have died from these injuries hours ago, but Morrison kept trying to sit up, kept asking for status reports from the battle raging outside. "Sir, you need to stay down," said Dr. Kate Wilson, the chief medical officer. Her own uniform was torn and bloodstained from treating dozens of casualties. Your body is in shock. If you keep moving around, you're going to die. Morrison managed a weak smile. Doc, I'm going to die anyway. Might as well die useful. He looked toward the medical bay's viewing window, where explosions lit up the darkness of space like deadly fireworks. How are we doing out there? The honest answer was that they were losing. The Void Swarm had adapted to human tactics with frightening speed. The ramming attacks that had been so effective in the first hour were now being anticipated and countered. The enemy ships had learned to scatter when human vessels approached at high speed, then reformed to surround and destroy the attackers. The suicide runs that had broken through their defensive lines were now being stopped by coordinated energy weapon fire. Colonel Ryan Martinez stood in the emergency command center, a hastily converted cargo bay that served as their backup bridge after the primary command center had been destroyed. Banks of computers and communication equipment had been bolted to the walls, their cables running across the floor like electronic spaghetti. The air was thick with smoke from overloaded circuits and the tension of impending defeat. Martinez was studying the tactical display with the grim focus of a man who knew he was running out of options. The human fleet had started with 43 ships. They were down to 18, and several of those were barely operational. Meanwhile, the Void Swarm seemed to have unlimited reinforcements, with new enemy ships arriving every few minutes to replace the ones that had been destroyed. "Colonel," called out Lieutenant Tom Bradley from the communications station. "Beta Squadron is reporting that their ramming run failed. The enemy scattered before impact, then reformed to surround them. We lost 3 ships and barely scratched their formation. Charlie Squadron's torpedo run was also unsuccessful," added Sergeant Lisa Murphy from the tactical station. "The Void Swarm ships are deploying some kind of energy net that's detonating our warheads before they reach their targets." Martinez nodded grimly. He had expected this. The Void Swarm was adapting faster than they could develop new tactics. Every strategy that worked once became useless within the hour as the enemy learned to counter it. The humans were running out of tricks, running out of ships, and running out of time. "Sir," said Bradley hesitantly, "Admiral Chen is requesting permission to implement Protocol 4. She wants to try a full frontal assault with everything we have left." Martinez shook his head. "Protocol 4 won't work. They've adapted to our direct assault tactics. We need something they haven't seen before." He paused, staring at the display where red dots representing human ships continued to disappear one by one. "All units, implement Protocol 7. The command center fell silent. Every human officer present turned to stare at Martinez with expressions of shock and disbelief. Protocol 7 was something they had hoped never to use, a tactical doctrine so extreme that it existed only in classified files that most soldiers didn't even know about. From his position near the viewing windows, Ambassador Kelrath had been watching the battle with growing horror and fascination. He had never seen combat before, his species had been peaceful for over 1,000 years, and the human way of war was unlike anything in their historical records. But something about Martinez's order had changed the atmosphere in the room. The humans looked different somehow, their expressions shifting from determination to something darker and more primal. "What is Protocol 7? Kelrath asked, approaching Martinez carefully. Before the colonel could answer, the medical bay's emergency doors burst open. Medical corpsman Janet Richards stumbled out, her uniform soaked with blood from multiple wounds. Her left arm was clearly broken, hanging at her side, and there was a deep gash across her forehead that kept bleeding despite the bandage she had wrapped around it. But she was still working. She was carrying medical supplies to the wounded soldiers who were too badly injured to make it to the medical bay. She moved from person to person, injecting pain medication, applying bandages, and checking vital signs, even though she was clearly in desperate need of medical attention herself. "Corpsman, you need to get back to medical," Martinez called out. "Negative, sir," Janet replied without stopping her work. "Too many wounded, not enough medics. I'll rest when the job's done." She knelt beside a young soldier who had third-degree burns covering half his body, carefully checking his pulse and adjusting his foredrip. This was what Kelrath was beginning to understand about humans. They didn't just fight until they were dead, they fought until they physically couldn't continue, and then they found ways to keep fighting anyway. He had watched soldiers with broken bones continue their duties, pilots flying missions with concussions, engineers repairing critical systems while bleeding from multiple wounds. The humans have been holding back, Kelrath realized, speaking his thoughts aloud. Everything we've seen so far, the ramming attacks, the suicide runs, the impossible maneuvers, that wasn't their maximum effort. They've been fighting under some kind of restraint. Martinez turned to look at the alien ambassador, and Kelrath felt a chill run down his spine. The colonel's eyes had changed. They were hollow, empty of everything except cold determination. This was the look of a man who had just made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Protocol 7 means we stop fighting like civilized soldiers, Martinez said quietly. It means we stop following the rules of war that we created to keep ourselves human. It means we embrace what we really are underneath all the discipline and training and moral codes. He turned back to the tactical display, where the Void Swarm was pressing their advantage, moving in for what looked like the final assault. Protocol 7 means we stop fighting like soldiers, Martinez continued, his voice barely above a whisper, and start fighting like humans. The order went out across the fleet, transmitted on emergency channels to every surviving human ship. And something fundamental changed in the way they fought. The tactical displays showed it first. Human ships began moving in patterns that made no tactical sense, executing maneuvers that violated every principle of military strategy. But they were working. The change was immediate and terrifying. Within minutes of Colonel Martinez implementing Protocol 7, the entire nature of the battle shifted in ways that defied every military textbook ever written. Human ships that had been retreating suddenly turned around and charged straight into the heart of the Void Swarm formations, not in coordinated attack patterns, but in seemingly random suicide runs that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Sergeant Kevin Mitchell was aboard the destroyer Vengeance when it took a direct hit from a Void Swarm plasma cannon. The blast tore through the ship's hull like paper, venting atmosphere and killing half the crew instantly. Standard procedure would have been to evacuate the remaining crew and abandon ship. Instead, Mitchell sealed himself into the engineering section and began manually overriding the reactor's safety protocols. This is Mitchell to any human ship in range, his voice crackled over the communications system, distorted by radiation interference from the damaged reactor core. I'm going to turn this whole ship into a bomb. I need someone to guide me to the biggest target they can find. Lieutenant Paul Grant, piloting a badly damaged fighter, responded immediately. I see you, Mitchell. There's a command ship about 2 clicks to your starboard. Big ugly thing with lots of tentacles. Perfect, Mitchell replied, his voice already starting to slur as radiation poisoning began affecting his nervous system. Tell my wife I love her, Grant. The destroyer Vengeance accelerated toward the Void Swarm command ship, its reactor building toward critical overload. Mitchell stayed at his post even as his body began shutting down from radiation exposure, manually adjusting the reactor's parameters to maximize the explosion. When the ship finally impacted the enemy vessel, the detonation was visible from 3 star systems away. But the truly frightening part wasn't the individual acts of heroism. It was how systematic it had become. The humans had somehow turned their own willingness to die into a weapon more effective than any missile or energy beam. They were using their capacity for sacrifice as a tactical advantage, creating situations where the Void Swarm's adaptive intelligence couldn't predict or counter their actions because those actions made no logical sense. Captain Rebecca Stone had volunteered to lead a boarding party into the heart of the enemy fleet. Her mission was to infiltrate the Central Void Swarm Command Node, a massive ship that coordinated the attacks of thousands of smaller vessels. It was a suicide mission in the most literal sense. There was no extraction plan, no backup support, no way to get her team out alive once they went in. Stone's boarding craft was little more than a reinforced shuttle with extra armor welded to its hull. Her team consisted of 12 volunteers, each carrying enough explosives to level a city block. They had been selected not for their tactical expertise, but for their ability to function under extreme stress and their willingness to complete the mission regardless of personal cost. "Remember, people," Stone said as their shuttle approached the enemy command ship, "we're not trying to get home. We're trying to make sure everyone else gets to go home. The Void Swarm can adapt to conventional tactics, but they can't adapt to crazy." The alien machines had detected their approach, of course. Energy weapons fired from dozens of gun emplacements, turning the space around their shuttle into a deadly light show. But Stone's pilot, Corporal Danny Torres, was flying like a man possessed, pulling maneuvers that should have torn their ship apart from gravitational stress. "Hang on, Captain," Torres called out as he spun the shuttle through a gap between two energy beams that was barely wider than their hull. "This is going to get bumpy." Torres brought them in through a waste disposal port that was never meant to accommodate a shuttle. The crash landing killed him instantly and left the rest of the team battered and bleeding, but they were inside the enemy ship. Stone picked herself up from the wreckage, checked her equipment, and looked around at her surviving team members. "Okay, people," she said, wiping blood from a cut on her forehead. "We've got about 20 minutes before they figure out we're here. Let's make them count." What followed was 20 minutes of the most destructive infiltration in military history. Stone's team moved through the Void Swarm command ship like a force of nature, placing explosives at critical junction points and fighting through mechanical defenders with a ferocity that seemed to surprise even the adaptive enemy AI. When the Void Swarm finally cornered them in the central command chamber, Stone and her remaining 3 team members were surrounded by hundreds of mechanical warriors. The situation was hopeless by any rational measure. Instead of surrendering or begging for mercy, Stone activated her communicator one last time. "This is Captain Stone to any human forces in range," she said calmly, while energy weapons charged around her. "Mission accomplished. The command node is rigged to blow in 30 seconds. Tell Earth we remembered who we are." The explosion that followed didn't just destroy the Void Swarm command ship. It sent a feedback pulse through their communications network that disrupted the coordination of every enemy vessel within 100 light-years. Thousands of Void Swarm ships suddenly found themselves operating without central guidance, their perfect tactical formations dissolving into chaos. From the observation deck of the Council Station, Ambassador Kelrath watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and horror. The humans had weaponized their own capacity for self-sacrifice, turning their willingness to die into something that the Void Swarm's logical mind simply couldn't process or counter. "They're not just fighting anymore," Kelrath whispered to himself. "They're becoming something else entirely." The Void Swarm, for the first time since the battle began, was showing signs of uncertainty. Their ships began pulling back from combat, retreating to safe distances while their artificial intelligence tried to process what it was seeing. These mechanical minds had been designed to adapt to any tactical situation, but they had never encountered an enemy that grew more dangerous as it grew more desperate. The humans weren't just willing to die for victory, they had figured out how to make their deaths more effective than their lives. Every suicide run was calculated to cause maximum damage. Every sacrifice was precisely targeted to create strategic advantage. They had turned desperation into a weapon that the enemy couldn't counter because it required a type of thinking that machines simply couldn't replicate. The tide of battle was turning, but the price was staggering. The human fleet was down to fewer than 10 operational ships, and even those were held together by spare parts and determination. The casualty reports were almost too horrific to read, but the humans kept fighting because giving up simply wasn't an option they could consider. Colonel Martinez watched the tactical displays with grim satisfaction as Void Swarm formations began to retreat. They were winning, but the cost would haunt humanity for generations. Every victory had been purchased with blood, every strategic advantage bought with lives that could never be replaced. But they were winning. The silence after the battle was more unsettling than the explosions had been. Ambassador Kelrath walked through the corridors of the human flagship, stepping carefully around debris and bloodstains that told the story of the most brutal conflict the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Void Swarm was gone, retreating into the dark spaces between stars, but the cost of victory was written on every bulkhead in scorch marks and human blood. Emergency lighting flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on walls that had been torn apart by enemy fire and hastily patched with whatever materials the crew could find. The air recycling system wheezed and groaned, working overtime to filter out the smoke and toxic fumes that lingered from damaged equipment. Every few steps, Kelrath passed memorial plaques that someone had already started mounting on the walls, simple metal plates with names and service numbers, honoring crew members who would never see home again. He found Colonel Ryan Martinez in what had once been the ship's command center. The room was barely recognizable now, its sophisticated holographic displays replaced by basic computer terminals salvaged from other parts of the ship. Chunks of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving twisted metal beams hanging at dangerous angles. Martinez sat at a makeshift desk constructed from storage containers, hunched over a tablet computer that displayed an endless list of names. The list of the dead. Martinez looked older than he had just hours before. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, and there was a haunted quality to his eyes that hadn't been there when the battle started. His left hand shook slightly as he scrolled through the names, pausing occasionally to read details about soldiers who had died under his command. Sergeant Kevin Mitchell, Martinez read quietly to himself. Age 24. Married. 2 kids back on Earth. He made a note on the tablet, probably details for the letter he would have to write to Mitchell's widow. Captain Rebecca Stone. Age 31. Single. Parents in New York. Another note, another family that would receive the worst news of their lives. Kelrath approached carefully, unsure if he should interrupt this private moment of grief. The human commander didn't look up from his work, but his voice carried clearly across the damaged room. Half the fleet is gone, Martinez said without emotion. 22 ships and their crews. That's about 8,000 people who went to sleep last night thinking they might see tomorrow. He finally looked up, and Kelrath was struck by the emptiness in the colonel's eyes. They won't. But you won, Kelrath said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. The void swarm is retreating. The galaxy is safe. Yes, Martinez replied, returning his attention to the tablet. We won. The question is whether winning was worth what we paid for it. Kelrath moved closer, studying the human commander's face for some sign of the savage barbarian that the galaxy had feared for 50 years. Instead, he saw only a tired man carrying the weight of impossible decisions and their consequences. The stories about human brutality had been true, but they had been incomplete. The galaxy had seen the humans' capacity for violence without understanding the burden that violence placed on their souls. Why? Kelrath asked, the question that had been haunting him since the battle began. Why fight so brutally for people you've never met? For species that have spent decades treating you like dangerous animals. We quarantined your entire civilization, and you still came when we called for help. Martinez set down the tablet and leaned back in his improvised chair. For a long moment, he stared at the damaged ceiling, as if trying to find the right words to explain something that had shaped his species for thousands of years. Do you know what Earth was like when my ancestors were evolving? Martinez asked. It wasn't the peaceful garden world that most species developed on. Our planet tried to kill us every single day. Ice ages that lasted for centuries. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun. Predators that could tear us apart with their bare claws. Diseases that could wipe out entire populations in weeks. He stood up and walked to the remains of the viewing window, looking out at the debris field where so many of his people had died. We learned early that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about being willing to sacrifice yourself so that others could live. The hunter who died fighting the saber-toothed tiger so his tribe could escape. The mother who gave her last food to her children during the famine. The warriors who held the mountain pass so their people could reach safety. But that was thousands of years ago, Kelrath protested. Your species has moved beyond those primitive conditions. Martinez shook his head. No, we haven't. We just found bigger threats to fight. When we developed agriculture, we fought to protect our crops from raiders. When we built cities, we fought to protect them from invaders. When we reached the stars, we started looking for threats that might come from space. He turned back to face Kelrath, and there was something ancient and weary in his expression. Someone has to stand guard while everyone else sleeps. Someone has to be ready to do the terrible things that keep the darkness at bay. But why you? Kelrath pressed. Why does it always have to be humans who bear this burden? Because we volunteered for the job a long time ago, Martinez replied simply. Every other species in the galaxy evolved on worlds that were kind to them. Beautiful planets with gentle climates and abundant resources. They developed art and philosophy and science, and that's wonderful. The galaxy needs beauty and wisdom and peaceful exploration. He picked up the tablet again, scrolling through more names of the dead. But the galaxy also needs someone who knows how to kill monsters. Someone who can look into the darkness and not blink. Someone who can make the hard choices that everyone else is too civilized to make. We called you monsters, Kelrath said quietly, remembering the debates in the Galactic Council about humanity's quarantine. Maybe we are, Martinez acknowledged. But we're your monsters. When the Void Swarm came, when every civilized species in the galaxy was facing extinction, who did you call? Not the philosophers or the artists or the peaceful explorers. You called the Deathworlders. You called the species that knows how to fight. The implications of those words settled over Kelrath like a cold blanket. The galaxy had spent 50 years fearing humanity, keeping them isolated and contained because of their capacity for violence. But when faced with an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated with, that same capacity for violence had been their salvation. The Galactic Council is meeting tomorrow, Kelrath said. They're going to vote on lifting humanity's quarantine. Martinez nodded. Good. Maybe now we can work together instead of in isolation. But don't expect us to change who we are. We've spent millions of years becoming very good at fighting monsters, and the universe keeps producing new ones. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Every species that had survived the Void Swarm's assault cast their ballot to welcome humanity into the galactic community. The debates that had raged for decades about human aggression and violence were settled in a single day. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the darkness could only be fought with darkness, and humans had volunteered to carry that burden so others wouldn't have to. The stars were safe now, protected by the blood and sacrifice of 8,000 humans who would never see home again. Their names would be carved on monuments throughout the galaxy, honored by species they had never met and probably never would have met under different circumstances. But the real monument to their sacrifice was simpler and more profound, a galaxy full of children who could sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, the monsters were standing guard.